from the first day, we will renegotiate NAFTA or we will terminate NAFTA. I personally don't think you can make a deal without a termination, but we're going to see what happens, okay? You're in good hands, I can tell you.
Is making public colleges and universities tuition-free so that all of our people have the opportunity to get a higher education in a competitive global economy. Is that a radical idea?
No! How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with.
That was President Donald Trump, Senator Bernie Sanders, and Senator Huey Long, all expressing some of their key different policies. All of them are radically different people fighting for radically different things, but they were also all incredibly popular with their respective bases. Now, in those clips, they were all using a specific rhetorical technique that emphasizes things like simplicity, authenticity, and anti-elite sentiments. Now, this video is about why the future is populism. After George Washington left office and the nation faced the first contested election in 1796, America was in the stages of centralization, which was an argument between states' rights or a strong federal government. And then from 1828 until 1852, now that began the era of the Jacksonians, a man who was the people's president, and one man who wished he was Old Hickory. And then from 1856 until 1892, now that was almost exclusively Republican rule, because yes, James Buchanan is just that awful. Then from 1896 until 1928, now that was the era of the progressive. I'm talking Teddy Roosevelt and allegedly Woodrow Wilson. From 1932 until 1972, we had the New Dealers. And from 1980 until the present day, we unfortunately are still in the era of neoliberalism. All right, Annie, smile if you hate Ronald Reagan. You hate Ronald Reagan? Come on, you're supposed to smile. Come on. Yeah! Now, this past election, however, of 2024 between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Kamala Harris, had sparked large debate among the modern Democratic Party about what the direction the party must go in response to their resounding loss. Now, while the Democratic leadership of the House and the Senate has largely verbally committed to resisting a second Trump administration agenda, there is widespread dissatisfaction of their response efforts from members of the party, both voters and congressional officials alike. The thing that got me thinking about why populism needs to be more incorporated into our politics to begin with is at the beginning of 2025, CNN released a poll that among the American public overall, the Democratic Party's favorability ratings fell to just 29%. That was a record low for polling data going all the way back to 1992. And it was a drop of 20 percentage points since January of 2021, when Donald Trump had exited his first term under the shadow of the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol. For context, the Republican Party's rating currently stands at 36%. Now that's alarmingly low as well, but for the Democratic Party to be even lower, that's something that's really a head-scratcher. But is it really? This can also be backed across the political spectrum. When we interpret data analyzing fundraising, political rally attendance, grassroots organizational engagement, and party de-enrollment from all parties, it indicates that people have officially had it with the establishment. Whereas from 2021 until 2024, according to the AAMC Center for Health Justice, the percentage of the population that trusted public and private institutions dropped in 8 out of 9 sectors, with only local school districts being the exception to services like higher ed, libraries, police and fire departments, pharmacies, hospitals, and social service agencies. Utilizing the polling of voting age individual sentiments towards populist messaging, historical sources about the Populist Party, and the mainstream party system's incorporation of populism to counteract the movements, global trends, and voting patterns in election cycles, one thing is for certain. Politics is an unpredictable business. The writing on the wall is there, and particularly there in the United States. We are on track to leave the sixth party system of neoliberalism and enter the era of populism. Populism has always been an active contributor in the realm of American politics, dating back to the American Revolution. To truly understand the influence of the practice, not just the preacher of the party, we must understand how it functioned. In the late 19th century, the People's Party, often referred to as the Populist Party or just the Populists, was an agrarian populist political party in the United States, primarily rallying around economic fairness for the common people in the era of the Gilded Age. According to the former U.S. Senator of Kansas and Populist Party member William Peffer of 1893, he stated, quote, "The Populist Party is an organized demand that the functions of government shall be exercised only for the mutual benefit of all people. It asserts that the government is useful only to the extent that it serves to advance the common weal. Believing that the public good is paramount to private interests, it protests against the delegation of sovereign powers to private agencies. Its motto is equal rights to all, special privileges to none. Its creed is written in a single line of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal." They started in 1892, nominating Iowa Congressman James Weaver, where he garnered 8.06 of the popular vote and 22 electoral votes. Now, the majority of its natural electorate was absorbed by the William Jennings Bryan wing of the Democratic Party in 1896, and the Populist Party, which had been a major force in the southern and western United States in the early 1890s and specifically 1892 election, it quickly began to wane. Professor of Political Science at Columbia University Shigeo Hirano studied how the emergence of the Populist Party affected voting behaviors of congressmen relevant to the populace in the late 1800s. Based on his analysis, it appears that major parties had begun to adopt basic populist policies even prior to the party's official formation in 1892, and that this adoption did not occur in tandem with the Populist Party's electoral gains. Now, this indicates that major parties incorporated populist policies in advance to mitigate the impact of third-party movements rather than responding to the election-driven populist sentiments. Toronto cites this when stating, quote, "The 1892 Omaha platform gave birth to the Populist Party, but not to new issues or to an observable change in mobilization strategies. The Omaha platform essentially incorporated most of the St. Louis and Ocala demands. The historical literature, to my knowledge, does not indicate that there was any sudden changes in preferences or voter mobilization activities other than what was associated with the introduction of the Populist Party. Thus, changes in congressional roll call votes related to populist issues between the Congress elected in 1892 may arguably be associated with the credibility of the populist electoral threat and the number of populists successfully elected offices across different states. Between 1892 and 1896, the Populist Party won more than 40 House of Representatives elections in about 10 different states. The Populist Party had enough support to control the state legislatures in 2 states, Kansas and Nebraska, and elections in 4 states, being Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and South Dakota. Now, the Populist Party was popular with the farmers and the laborers in the South and the West, who were suffering from economic decline due to deflation, monopolistic banking, and railroad practices. Now, the party was not as popular up in the Northeast, as the rich bankers and the big business interests resided in that area. Think of Wall Street. Now, their support base, although extremely passionate, was confined to certain regions that disunited, which made it extremely difficult to build a national support coalition. Now, the Populist Party's failure to secure long-term success, even after having considerable ideological impact, stems from a mix of structural, strategic, and contextual reasons. Now, on the surface, there is a two-party system and a winner-takes-all system, and that is what makes the third-party existence nearly impossible. It is, however, important to note that populism is not exclusive to one branch of government, or even an elected office for that matter. Attorneys and judges use it within the judicial system when they argue or instruct the jury to help persuade them one way or the other. Presidential candidates utilize this as well when they run their campaigns to try to create broader coalitions that elect them to the White House. But most of all, legislative candidates at all levels of government utilize populism to create excitement around their candidacies, especially because they are not subject to the Electoral College, as it's raw popular vote that gets you a seat. Now, for that reason, this is why we see trends in the increased use of populism when a congressional candidate is running in a contested race. Gennaro, Leahy, and Morelli all explore how far along in the election cycle candidates use populist rhetoric and where their focus lies in terms of the supply side of their populism. Now, they theorize that for certain candidates, particularly outsiders, that there is a greater propensity to employ populist tactics when appealing to voters facing severe economic anxieties, especially during closer contests. And with the help of automated text analysis, the author scraped campaign websites from the 2018 and 2020 U.S. congressional elections, and they created a longitudinal measure of the level of populism in campaign texts. Now, it was found that the politically competitive districts, outsider candidates tended to increase their populist rhetoric in response to severe economic distress among constituents. Now, this indicates that candidates view such rhetoric as motivational for turnout within certain economic and political contexts. Now, the study highlights the peripheral context of economics and politics at the local level that is critical in relation to the demand and supply of populism. In this case, arguing that candidates seem to be adjusting their rhetoric to the prevailing perceptions and fears of the audiences they intend to appeal to. Now, this study gives us a deeper understanding regarding the enactment of populism by focusing on how voter mobilization theory interacts with populist discourse, whereas they state, quote, for disillusioned voters, a one standard deviation increase in their candidate's populism leads to a 2.7 percentage point increase in turnout intention. For core voters, however, the relationship is reversed. A one standard deviation increase in populism results in a nearly 2-point percentage decrease. Interestingly enough, the positive effect of populism on turnout for disillusioned voters remains consistent across measures of turnout, influencing both intentions and actual voting behavior. However, the negative effect on core voters is less persistent. They initially express lower turnout intentions in response to populism, but often end up voting anyway. Now, moreover, it elucidates how the integration of candidate features, the level of competition in the election, and the state of the economy all impact the campaign strategies that are adopted by congressional candidates.
Now, the nature of populism here in the United States is quite different throughout the country as well. Now, post-election analysis all points towards drastic demographic shifts in the voting patterns of the working class. Now, it's no surprise to see this when in the past 3 election cycles of 2016, 2020, and 2024, published by Eliza Collins in 2016, among United States adults the day before Election Day, Hillary Clinton had a 56% unfavorability rating, while Trump was at 63%. In 2020, Biden was viewed favorably by 54% of U.S. adults, while Trump was only at 47%. Now, while that's up from 2016, that still remains very much lower than the norm. And though Clinton lost despite being heavily favored, and Biden only won by razor-thin margins, 37,000 votes could overturn that election to the House. Penn State labor employment relations professor Paul Clark provided some differing data on Michael Martin's NPR show.
It predates Trump, but I think Trump really tapped into it and accelerated the transition. I think the economic issues are certainly part of it. These workers feel like they've been left behind. Globalization has benefited many groups, but not them. There's a certain resentment and anger, and I think Trump has tapped into that. I also think that he's touched on some changes in terms of working class voters prioritizing social and cultural issues, DEI and racial issues, the number of immigrants coming into many working class communities, transgenderism, guns, abortion. Trump has really become a part of working class culture in this country.
How do you know that?
You can look at the data in terms of by income that defines working class voters. In the 2008 election, Obama got 63% of voters making less than $50,000, and McCain got 35%. That's a 28% margin. In 2012, Obama got 60%. It fell to a 22% margin. In 2024, Harris got 48.5% and Trump 49%, meaning that between 2008 and 2024, the Democrats lost almost 30% of working class voters. And that's enough to explain the outcomes of the election by itself.
And that's voters making less than $50,000 a year?
Yes.
Okay.
These findings are both consequential and damning for Democratic strategists, but they're also understandable under a broader analysis of how the two major United States political parties, being the Democrats and the Republicans, interact with their bases and with one another. Political science professor Thomas Grevin dissects persistent progression in American populism, structured within the given framework of the United States dual-party system, where he spotlights both its unique benefits and consequences for the soundness of continued democratic governance. He asserts that specifically American populism, especially by the brand of the GOP, represents a mixed yet identifiable combination of identity, racial, cultural, and economic political narratives that have remodeled the party's electoral strategies and public ideological stance. Traditionally, the Republican Party has utilized right-wing populist discourse focused on cultural and identity-based appeals to energize its primary supporters, mainly white Christian voters and sometimes white supremacists, while resisting more economically progressive populist initiatives such as Trump's tariff regime and his protectionist ideas in trade. Now, this makes Donald Trump's emergence and the shift in the party a little bit more understandable, as the party began to integrate to a more overt form of economic populism into its agenda, which resonated with significant portions of the white working class that played a crucial role in Trump's electoral victories in 2016, in his close contest in 2020, and his huge win in 2024, and the party's robust performance in down-ballot elections when they seemingly had no chance. I'm talking about the Herschel Walkers, who had no business of being in the Senate to begin with. I'm talking about Ohio being Obama +3 and then Trump +8. I'm talking about Iowa being Obama +6 and then being Trump +13 in the last election. Grevin highlights this when he states, quote, "White voters participate in elections at a significantly higher rate than minority voters, and the GOP continues to enjoy structural advantages in the Electoral College and in the United States Senate because of the overrepresentation of rural voters, as well as in the House of Representatives due to the self-sorting of Democratic voters in dense urban and suburban areas and the Republican-dominated gerrymandering of electoral districts. However, the shrinking share of white voters has meant that the GOP has had to increase its turnout and decrease the turnout of minority and young voters. Now, this has set the stage for more overt radical populist tendencies and for a resurgence of GOP economic populism to reappeal itself to the white working class. First, however, the Republicans suffered an election loss because of the third-party spoiler candidacy of Ross Perot, who championed himself as an anti-free trade, specifically anti-NAFTA message in 1992, and helped Democrat Bill Clinton win the presidency. In the Republican primary, Pat Buchanan, himself an Irish Catholic, side note, we don't claim him, had championed an economic populist agenda of America First, and he increased anti-immigrant nativism. He should be considered the precursor of Donald Trump's political strategy. At the time, the GOP was not ready for Buchanan's message and selected traditional country club conservative George H.W. Bush. Now, the Republicans' next winning re-election campaign, that of George W. Bush in 2004, focused instead on culture wars, issues such as abortion and gay marriage, while at least taking baby steps towards appealing to Latino American voters beyond the anti-communist Cubans in Florida. Now, Grevin correctly argues that the outcome of the cultural and identity resentment that's parallel with the economic nationalism and isolationism that has radicalized the Republican Party's electorate is angling it to be a more exclusionary and anti-democratic party. Now, this metamorphosis has worsened the political polarization in the United States, manifesting not exclusively on the basis of policy disputes, but also along the deeply rooted cultural and primitive divisions. This is jeopardizing our democratic ideals and institutions and our customs. Now, in disparity, the Democratic Party, while in theory they would be ideologically positioned to advocate in favor of economic populism, has persistently faced challenges in portraying a unified response. Now, this indicates that the internal conflicts and the hesitancy by leadership to adopt a class-based populist message has impeded the Democrats' effort to reconnect with disillusioned working-class voters, which is largely responsible for their consistent shortcomings. Yes, I am looking at you, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer. Now, ultimately, this distinctive traits of America's brand of populism, particularly in its combination of cultural retaliation, reactionary nature, and economic dissatisfaction, have all had significant and debilitating impacts on our party politics and the democratic governance in the United States.
But it's important to understand how the voters themselves feel. Now, populism refers to a range of political stances that emphasize the idea of the people, often juxtaposing this group against the elite. Now, the term was developed in the 19th century and has been applied to various politicians, parties, and movements since that time, most often not self-identified. All the same, it has been deployed in many instances and is still utilized today. Aforementioned, Gennaro, Lecce, and Morelli found that the candidates in the United States use populism both specifically and particularly at the congressional level to enhance the voter turnout, even when it's an off-year election cycle. Now, the reason that high-propensity voters voting anyways is significant is that because the guiding policy of populism is centered around prioritizing the people over the elite, as aforementioned, so it's important to analyze polling data to see how certain situations, through the lens of populist framing, would resonate with the people in the United States and the broader globe. Now, that specific data will highlight the percentage of people in a given nation that support and appreciate the sentiments proposed to them. Those findings prove that populism does lead on average to higher turnout. However, it still begs the question, what material change do voters actually believe in? Clifford Young's Ipsos Global Advisor Survey, which gathered data from 28 countries, offers an in-depth look at the current global landscape of populism, with specific emphasis on the common theme of anti-elitism and nativism. Now, it's important to note that the methodology when drawing conclusions from public polling data. Now, Young states, "We first developed the index in Latin America in the early 2000s, redeployed the index in the US in 2015, and have been tracking the sentiment globally since 2016. Critically, the index captures discontent with the prevailing political establishment and the public's willingness for leaders to break the rules in order to fix their country. Typically, we see long-term economic and demographic change as the driving forces behind populist sentiment. Take, for example, the relatively high percentage of foreign-born people living in the U.S. right now. Politically, former President Donald Trump has taken advantage of these changing demographics by blaming the U.S.'s problems on the influx of immigrants. Here, within the given opportunity structure, groups like immigrants, elites, experts, and ethnic minorities are blamed for the problems facing the nation. The specific populist target will depend on the context and the country, but the blame game is the hammer of the populist's toolbox. According to the data, the survey highlights a widespread erosion of trust in political institutions and of the elites, reflecting a broader dissatisfaction with the status quo. Now, these populist ideologies perceive politics as a conflict and direct opposition between the ordinary citizen and the self-interested, disconnected elite, and have gained more motion in part due to the widespread perception that systemic power structures ignore their issues by design, not by the individuals themselves. And because of this, populists often respond positively to anti-immigration, anti-globalization, and nativist perspectives that spotlight the importance of cultural conservation, and the rights of the native-born individuals can sometimes align with this viewpoint. Now, the findings indicate that these beliefs are increasingly gaining prominence globally, especially in areas marked by significant social and economic disparities. Now, consequently, the survey demonstrates how nativist and populist narratives are shaping political dialogue in 2024, as individuals seek leaders whom they believe will challenge the status quo and more directly address their grievances. Now, this extensive survey took place from November 22nd until December 6th of 2023 and was utilized by its Global Advisor online platform alongside the India Bus platform, specifically in India. Now, the survey incited into 20,630 adults with age ranges ranging differently from country to country. For instance, 18 plus in India, 18 to 74 in several nations such as the United States and the UK, and 16 to 74 in most others. Now, approximately 1,000 participants were surveyed in 10 countries, which included the United States and Germany, while around 500 individuals were surveyed in 18 other countries. Now, India featured a larger sample with approximately 2,200, with the majority being interviewed in person. Now, in countries like the US and Canada and Germany, the samples were largely representative of the general adult populace under 75, whereas in nations like Brazil, Indonesia, and Mexico, the samples tended to be more urban, more educated and affluent, reflecting a demographic that is more digitally engaged rather than the broader population. Now, after taking account of all those confounding variables, 63% of respondents reported a particular sentiment in 2023. Now, Thailand led the charge with 80%, followed closely by South Africa at 79, Indonesia at 77, Malaysia at 76, and India at 74. Now, Poland, Sweden, and Germany were among the lowest at 51%, 48%, and 47%, respectively. Now, over the years, some countries have showed consistent upward trends. For example, Thailand rose from 66% to 2022 to 80% in 2023, while others, such as Germany, maintained relatively low levels across all years. Now, it's important to note that countries experiencing the effects of late-stage capitalism and nations with a long history of colonization reported the highest percentage of agreement. And I know you're thinking, yeah, global trends, but this video is about the United States. Well, the reason that all of this is so significant is particularly that here in the United States, 1 in 5 respondents states that neither they agree or disagree with the given prompt. Now, therefore, an overwhelming 86% of the American public is in favor, or at the very least indifferent, to the populist notion proposed. Now, only 14% of our citizens rejected that premise of the asserted notion. Now, the most significant part of these findings are the specific spotlight on the overlap between the beliefs of those in the left and the right or the center. Now, liberals and conservatives, fascists and leftists alike, they all agreed on the notion that when framed in the formation of populist rhetoric. Now, that's not to say that progressive policy shouldn't be included in tandem with populism, because I am fervent in my belief of the expansion of the social safety net and protection for all individuals, documented or undocumented. Now, the survey was not exclusive to party lines, but it was conclusive in the desires of the public. If the left wants to improve their perception, populist rhetoric must be engaged with to run a successful campaign. Disorganization is a bad front to be on. Most Democrats don't know who the face of the party is. And if Democrats want to win, they have to actually be left-wing. There can't be any more capitulating to right-wing framing on certain issues like immigration or the economy or different things like that. For the love of God, stop trying to appeal to the median voter that does not exist. Liz Cheney does not move the needle for leftists. Now, it's a lot to take in, so let's take a step back. What is most striking from the evidence is that populism, though it's ideologically malleable and even often imprecise, has an incredible uniformity of appeal across time, geography, and party. Now, in the past, the transitory populist party of the 1890s left a disproportionate legacy. That was, as Harana pointed out, the two parties had already begun to co-opt populist demands before the rise of the Populist Party at the polls, suggesting that the power of populism lies not in electoral triumph, but in forcing mainstream political compromise. This advance incorporation shows that populism is not so much a third-party revolt as a signal of displeasure with the established powers that they cannot discount. The same trend occurs in contemporary politics. Congressional candidates, particularly political outsiders, intensify their populist appeals in economically distressed districts, according to Gennaro, Lecce, and Morelli. Now, most notably, the same shift has a tangential suppressive effect on core voters' intentions to turnout, though these voters will probably vote anyways. Now, these findings suggest that populist appeals are most effective at mobilizing economically fearful and politically disaffected constituents, cohorts traditionally regarded as low propensity or volatile voters. Now, worldwide, populism appears to be more the norm than the exception. Young's Ipsos Global Advisor poll reported that among Americans, 86% were sympathetic to or neutral on populist sentiment, leaving only 14% in the I don't know or I oppose. Now, this puts the U.S. in line with global trends, particularly in countries experiencing economic instability or demographic transformation. Now, in different nations, populism thrives where there is discontent with political elites and structural disparity. Now, as Young explains, populist sentiment is often in the shape of blaming the elite, and in different countries, the blame gets assigned to other groups, whether that be immigrants, professionals, minority communities, or international governing bodies. That depends on the situation. Here in the United States, more specifically, party politics has played a key role in determining the boundaries of today's populism. Now, Grevin feels that the Republican Party, which traditionally has been associated with cultural and identity-based appeals, began going towards economic populism under Trump. Now, this helped the right monopolize populist discourse in our society and media. Now, that is what helped the GOP to solidify its base among the white working class, particularly in the rural areas, where cultural grievance and economic disillusionment intersects.
The Democratic Party has not been able to define a consistent populist appeal, however. Though well situated to embrace class-based economic populism, internal bickering and elite hesitation have kept a clear strategic response at bay, as backing has faltered among working-class voters. Now, taken together, these findings support the comprehension of populism as not being a rigid ideology, but a rhetorical strategy. Now, it is used throughout the political spectrum to simplify complex socio-political challenges into a moral framework, the people against the elite. Now, the platform is emotionally and politically charged, especially in periods of institutional skepticism and economic insecurity. That's what we're facing right now with the Trump tariffs and all sorts of pushback against ICE and different things like that. Now, the test for the future, particularly as America appears to be on the cusp of entering the seventh party system, is for the two major parties to align their core values with populist language that voters are increasingly drawn to. Now, ultimately, the strength of populism is its resilience. Whether it's wielded by right-wing nationalists or left-wing reformers, it plays on deeply rooted public grievances. Now, how parties choose to deploy that strength to responsibly or irresponsibly claim it for their own purposes is what will determine the next chapter in American politics. Now, hopefully, the left understands that populism is what is going to lead them to actually being elected, and then we can have the actual progressive changes that we strive for. My hope is that your takeaway from this video is understanding the conflict between what individuals think and what they actually do in the political culture of the present. Now, what this research uncovers through historical perspective and present knowledge is that populism is not some flash in the pan or a method employed solely by fringe actors. It's a persistent, evolving political force that is deeply ingrained in American democracy. The right wing has monopolized populist discourse and populist media and portrayal, and that is why the left needs to counteract it with populism. Their policies are consistently polled at higher approval. That's why the left just needs to engage in more class-based economic populism. And more deeply, it shows how language and mood and public confidence all intersect into more precarious configurations. Now, why is that important? Because the moment now in American politics is past left or right, Trumpism or traditionalism in proxy to conservatism. It's about a structural shift in how citizens are beginning to think about power and legitimacy and representation. And now it rests upon the originary story structure of the American identity, from the revolution to Jacksonian democracy to the outsider politics of today. Now, what we see in polling statistics and election victories and at the grassroots level is a return to that narrative, albeit in new garb. It discovers a paradox that Americans will not embrace the word populism due to our party systems, preferring to associate it with things like extremism or demagoguery or previous failure. But they embrace the substance of it, the rhetoric that is for the common man, that shakes up the established institutions, that speaks in plain language about real fears. It's a rhetorical and essentially human contradiction. Now, populist language is emotionally charged inherently, and identity shaping and politically inciting. That's why it succeeds, despite being distrusted. This analysis further shows how leading political parties, both Democrats and Republicans, strategically appropriate populist language in order to maintain power without embracing the ideological risks of full populist alignment. Such selective adoption reflects a political marketplace where emotional resonance is apt to trump policy nuance. The emphasis of this author on raw data, examples being congressional campaign rhetoric and voter turnout studies, it sets the stage in proving that populism is not an outskirts-only phenomena, but a mainstream strategy with measurable effects on participation, especially among disillusioned and economically strained voters. It underscores the fragility of our institutional trust. We already reviewed the polling and sociological data that confidence in almost all institutions, governmental or private, is decreasing. Populism is what fills that gap. That's worth recognizing, since in low-trust environments, populism will thrive and either revitalize democracy by demanding responsibility for them, or destroy it by encouraging our anti-institutional fervor. Now, that confrontation is still unresolved, and it's very urgent. But that is up to the individual elected officials to decide. That's why we need populist left-wing officials who put people first, not the government's surveillance or the military. We need housing first. We need universal health care. We need a coordinated response to climate change and things of that nature. Now, ultimately, the most important thing is that it shatters the traditional political dichotomy. One of the most fascinating results of the research is that the ideological overlap around presumed opposites. When populist communication is stripped of its partisan verbiage, its support transcends leftists, right wingers, or centrist neoliberals. Now, this suggests that our traditional political denominations are less and less useful of predictors of behavior. The rhetoric of the people against the elite, it resonates with socialists and nationalists alike, even if it is for contrasting reasons. Now, that crossing complicates traditional electoral strategies and requires rethinking of how we teach and study and engage with political rhetoric. Now, this research is important because it reminds us, especially those of us in the humanities and social sciences fields, to think about the power of rhetoric not just as an ornament, but as a political force. Now, it invites scrutiny of how narrative and tone and framing construct public reality. It also shows us that voter sentiment is not just shaped by material conditions, although it largely is, but by emotional appeals to dignity, belonging, and voice. Populism is not just a political ideology, it is a narrative form. And as illustrated before, any American loves a good story in their politics. Politicians just need the guts to defect from the elite. And better yet, we need politicians who are not part of the elite. Now, thank you so much for watching. If you do like this content, please try to share it because this is a new project of mine that I would like to try to grow this media. Share this video. Go follow me on Instagram at InRealityPolitics for some more day-to-day posts and some more generalized content. Again, thank you so much for watching. Please share this video and let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next. Thanks. Bye.